The moon has been usually associated with women. Ancient Greek culture associated one with the other, and poets and writers deemed it as a female entity. The reason is probably the lunar cycle, that averages 29 days, pretty much the same as the average menstrual cycle, which we will see in this video. To learn about the menstrual cycle, which comprises of changes in the ovary and the uterus. The reproductive life of a girl begins at the age of 10 to 12 years. This onset of the menstrual cycle is called menarche. Let us focus our attention on the female reproductive organ, namely the ovary. Each menstrual cycle averages 28 days, which is divided into 3 phases. Flow, follicular, luteal phase. The first phase is the flow phase. It lasts for 3 to 5 days. During this phase, in the uterus, the menstrual flow begins where the menstrual fluid contains blood, unfertilized ovum along with the tissues of the endometrium. This is also linked to the changes in hormonal activity. During this phase in the ovary, we observe an increase in the level of the hormones FSH, follicle-stimulating hormone, and LH, luteinizing hormone, secreted by the pituitary gland present in the brain. These hormones reach the ovary. Under the influence of FSH and LH, the primordial follicle in the ovary matures into the primary follicle. The follicle starts producing the hormone estrogen. From day 6 to day 13 is the follicular phase. Here the primary follicle develops into a secondary follicle. Prior to ovulation, the follicle expands to form a swelling on the surface of the ovary. While maturation of follicle is taking place in the ovary, in uterus, the endometrium under the influence of estrogen in the ovary begins to reform. On day 14 the LH levels peak. The proteolytic enzymes produced in the follicle cause the wall to weaken and rupture, and ovulation occurs. Secondary oocyte is released from the mature follicle. This is known as ovulation. After ovulation from day 15 to day 28, the menstrual cycle enters the luteal or secretory phase. The ruptured follicle in the ovary is converted to corpus luteum, which begins to secrete the hormone progesterone. Meanwhile, in the uterus, the endometrium in the presence of estrogen and progesterone continues to thicken and become vascular. During this stage, if the secondary oocyte is fertilized by a male gamete, that is the sperm, then this results in pregnancy, where the implantation of the embryo occurs in the mature uterus. But if at this stage the fertilization of secondary oocyte does not occur, the corpus luteum in the ovary begins to transform into corpus albicans, thus drastically lowering the progesterone level. As the level of progesterone drops, it causes spasms in the uterine wall. This leads to the breakdown of the vascular endometrium. Menstruation starts again and the flow phase of the cycle begins, leading to the continuation of the menstrual cycle. Decreased levels of progesterone and estrogen signal the pituitary to increase FSH secretion, initiating the development of another follicle, and the menstrual cycle repeats itself. So, the rhythmic series of changes in sex organs that occur under the influence of the hormones secreted by the pituitary and the sex hormones, about every 28 days throughout the reproductive phase of a female, is called the menstrual cycle. Permanent cessation or stoppage of menstrual cycles in a female occurring between the age of 45 to 50 years is called menopause. Summary. The reproductive life of a girl begins at the age of 10 to 12 years. This onset of the menstrual cycle is called menarche. Flow phase. Here in the uterus, the shedding of the uterine lining happens, causing the menstrual flow. FSH and LH influence the primordial follicle in the ovary to mature into the primary follicle, which starts producing estrogen. Follicular phase. Primary follicle develops into a secondary follicle. While maturation of follicle is taking place in the ovary, in the uterus, the endometrium begins to reform. On day 14 the LH levels peak, causing ovulation. Secondary oocyte is released from the mature follicle. Luteal or secretory phase is the phase after ovulation from day 15 to day 28. Corpus luteum begins to secrete the hormone progesterone. Meanwhile in the uterus, the endometrium in the presence of estrogen and progesterone continues to thicken and become vascular. But if at this stage the fertilization does not occur, the corpus luteum transforms into corpus albicans, thus drastically lowering the progesterone level. This progesterone level drop causes spasms in the uterine wall, leading to the breakdown of the vascular endometrium. Permanent cessation or stoppage of menstrual cycles in a female occurring between the age of 45 to 50 years is called menopause. Now we know what happens when females ovulate and the egg is not fertilized. But what if the egg is fertilized by the sperm at a proper timing? We'll dive into the topic.